The theme of this symposium provides an opportunity to consider the place of Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophy within classical Nyingma soteriology. My point of departure will be Longchenpa's summary of the Prasangika philosophy in the 12th chapter of his auto-commentary on the Yijin Zi, the Pema Karpo. His summary is organized, appropriately enough, around the question of when it makes sense to have or not have a thesis. I will briefly consider how Prasangika figures in Nyingma doxographical and soteriological schemes. Then I will turn to a very selective appraisal of the Pema Karpo summary, guided by two orienting questions. Number one, what did Longchenpa identify as the most important contributions of the Prasangika philosophy? And number two, what implications did these have for classical Nyingma soteriology? Section 1, the place of Prasangika Madhyamaka in Nyingma soteriology. Nyingma scholars from Longchenpa onward have unanimously and perhaps unsurprisingly regarded the Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophy as the summit of Buddhist philosophical systems presented in the Mahayana Sutras. I say unsurprisingly because Prasangika philosophy, particularly as propounded by Nagarjuna and interpreted by Chandrakirti, was held in this regard by all the ascendant schools of Tibetan Buddhism in the classical period, 12th to 14th century. It is necessary, however, to qualify the Nyingmapa's high estimation of Prasangika philosophy with the observation that the study of Buddhist sutric philosophy plays something of a preparatory role in the context of Nyingma soteriology as a whole. In strictly doxographical terms, the place of Madhyamaka within the Nyingma ninefold yana scheme is the third yana up from the bottom, the Bodhisattva yana, with mantra yana stretching up and beyond. Within the 12th chapter of Longchenpa's Yijin Zi, devoted to the non-Buddhist and Buddhist Siddhanta, Prasangika philosophy is presented as the peak of the Hetu Lakshana yana, the cause-oriented vehicle of characteristics. The remainder of the Siddhanta chapter outlines the tantric philosophies of the Palaguya Mantrayana, the goal-oriented vehicle of secret mantra, after first explaining how they are superior in theory and practice to the Hetu Lakshanayana. In all his Siddhanta summaries, Longchenpa gives special attention to this crucial transition from cause-oriented to goal-oriented vehicles and specifies the shift of perspectives this involves. Then he gives a long block quote from the Drupta Zi, the Treasury of Philosophical Systems, where Longchenpa compares the Lakshanayana to the Mantrayana, and says that the Lakshanayana, and he distinguishes them in terms of ground, path, and goal, and he says that the Lakshanayana he distinguishes conventional truth from ultimate truth, or as Longchenpa says, the profound and the extensive, by saying the profound takes the profound as an objective, a mental construct that you approach through rational inference, and this is approached through a kind of willful striving, through Shine and Laktong. And then it has a goal, a teleological goal that is approached after a long period of many eons. And in contrast, the Mantrayana, it is not approached through recourse to logical reasoning. You simply work with the vital points of the body and the speech and the winds and channels and stuff like that. And in this way, one ascertains non-conceptual primordial gnosis that is not a mental construct, but the very quintessence of Dharmakaya as the ground. And by then letting the mind remain naturally in this state, one realizes in one lifetime or less the ultimate truth that is the Dharma Dhatu, whereby spiritual awakening becomes fully manifest. And then later he says, nothing is to be accepted or rejected, and thus it is a teaching that shows how anything at all can become the path. So how does this Madhyamaka philosophy of Nagarjuna and Chandrakirti figure in all this? Its place in Nyingma doxographical schemes could tempt one to conclude that Prasangika for the Nyingmapa is a prelude to bigger and better things, and that its principal role is to clear the way of reifying tendencies for a less distorted engagement with Mantrayana. This is in part correct and consistent with the unanimously held Tibetan view that Mantrayana systems are superior to the Paramitayana or Lakshanayana. But one must also recognize that Longchenpa and many other Tibetan scholastics tend to treat Prasangika as a complete and, more importantly, reliable system of liberation with its own efficacious views, practices, and soteriological aims. Kagyu and Nyingma traditions sometimes refer to these to three great systems of liberation in Tibetan Buddhism: Uchen, Chakchen, and Dzogchen, where Uchen, or Great Madhyamaka, refers to a system of study and practice based on the correct understanding and application of Prasangika philosophy. Section 2, key points of Prasangika in the Yijinzi summary of philosophical systems. Longchenpa prefaces his summary by affirming the philosophy of Nagarjuna as the pinnacle of Buddhist sutric philosophy and Chandrakirti as its most authoritative interpreter. Later in the Pema Karpo, Longchenpa will emphasize that Nagarjuna's is the only sutric philosophy to have clearly recognized the indivisibility of the true truths, of appearance and emptiness, which allows for the crucial transcendence of discursive elaborations, prapancha, and extremes, koti. And then there's a lot of Longchenpa that follows. I guess I'll read the first part here. The summary begins with a brief statement of the Prasangika Madhyamaka philosophical approach, and he's quoting now. The unmistaken meaning of Chandrakirti's classic treatises is here briefly summarized as follows. The basic way things are is, in essence, not established as any intrinsic nature whatsoever. Yet all claims involve an attachment to truth, denshin. Thus, the claims made in the classical texts belonging to the traditions of proponents of intrinsic nature, Svabhavavadan, are therefore mired in internal contradictions. All that is discussed in the classical texts of those who make claims by appeal to the power of facts, vastu bala pravritta, and hence refuted. But following this negation, there ensues no definitive thesis, as would be the case for the Svatantrika. And then he quotes the verse from the Vigraha Vyavartani. If I had any thesis, I would thereby have an error. But since I have no thesis, I am ipso facto without error. Longchenpa notes that meaning of this passage may be ascertained by way of three pertinent contexts. Thus, these he uses as categories to structure his summary. Number one, the first context pertains to methods of negating discursive elaborations on the understanding that the way things fundamentally are is, in essence, without claims or propositions. The second context pertains to methods of presentation that do not negate in accordance with how things appear conventionally. And the third context presents other types of presentation involving making or not making claims. So, in the summary, Longchenpa will investigate and evaluate Prasangika views when it makes sense to have claims or not have claims. As the idea of making claims has been sufficiently loose in the classical texts as to make almost any position plausible, Longchenpa attempts to clarify different meanings this can have in different contexts. I will confine my focus to the problems of thesislessness and the two truths. Number one, when to not have a thesis. Here, Longchenpa identifies two contexts when it makes sense to not have a thesis. A, when debating philosophical schools on the basis of each other's presuppositions, and B, when reaching freedom through discernment on the path. About the first, he says, A, during philosophical debates, because one entertains no position or claims of one's own, there is no need to prove a thesis or abandon an error. One points out the internal contradictions inherent in the classical texts of these proponents of true existence. And B, reaching freedom through discernment. As for the second case, when cultivating the abiding condition, One abandons everything with which the mind is normally occupied in order to realize a lucid, objectless state in which the mind, deprived of its habitual recourse to objects, be they so-called outer entities or an inner entity mind, comes to rest in its natural condition. One remains in a state in which mind, deprived of its habitual recourse to objects, is free from all mentalistic, linguistic proliferations, so that one is able to recognize its lucid and unfabricated nature. In the concluding section of his summary on other presentations concerning having or not having a thesis, Longchenpa summarizes 3 Tibetan schools of thought on the thesis problem. The schools are categorized into those who endorse A, not making claims, a strong no thesis thesis, B, making claims, a strong thesis, or C, a balanced synthesis. And then I think I'm going to skip to the conclusion at this point. Longchenpa concludes with a brief historical sketch of a strong thesis and no thesis positions and a plea for a more nuanced approach. It would appear that earlier generations of Madhyamakas did not carefully I'm quoting now Longchenpa. It would appear that earlier generations of Madhyamakas did not carefully distinguish these approaches. Thus, Tsongpa exemplified not making claims, where Maja, Zhangchu Tsunju, exemplified making claims. As both positions can be seen to have certain merits and certain shortcomings, it is evident that the authors somewhat overlooked the actual meaning of the classical texts. Having opened the eyes through intelligent analysis and through looking into the majority of the scriptural traditions, I have here clearly revealed the meanings that lie concealed and dispersed within the classical texts. Know that when in the future anyone sets forth this thesis, it will be through the power of this treatise of mine. Thus concludes the discussion of the way of the Prasangika of the great Madhyamaka. And that's the end of the quote. So 2 particular points emphasized in Longchenpa's summary are worth mentioning in conclusion. One concerning knowledge, contemplative thesislessness. The other concerning truth, the indivisibility of the true truths. The idea of contemplative thesislessness, which corresponds to the idea of non-elaboration, nishprapancha, consists in the de-identification with the reifying activities of mind that both distort and conceal primordial modes of being and knowing that constitute our most fundamental engagement with reality. As the author states in his Tekchok Tzu, that any of the philosophies fabricated by the intellect do not actually exist is asserted by Nagarjuna in order to pacify discursive elaborations. The Prasangikas may apply categories of linguistic cognition in accordance with whatever the worldly posit about what simply appears as various things. However, since there are no claims, and since phenomenal presence goes beyond constructions of truth and falsity, the Prasangikas maintain that this phenomenal presence is from this very moment, free from the limits of existence and non-existence, end quote. He says, we see in this passage a shift from the context of propositional truth, the intersubjective world of shared practices, to the space of phenomenal presence with which all communication and truth-making is situated. And then I'm going to skip the part about Heidegger. And just, you want the Heidegger? I can put the Heidegger in. Okay, it didn't look like it. In the Nyingma tradition, the ground of the possibility of propositional truth is identified as the simple taking place of presence, the self-occurring primordial gnosis and its empty expanse, a basic opening onto the world that is without intrinsic nature. On this view, truth, or better, reality in this context, is the single experiential dimension, the indivisibility of appearing and emptiness, non-ton germé, that is progressively disclosed as the superimpositions that obscure it are cleared. The path is here conceived as a clearing process, jungje, that progressively lays bare one's natural condition. When Longchenpa returns to the of the two truths in the 18th chapter of his Pema Karpo, he views them from a Mantrayana standpoint, emphasizing their indivisibility within the scope of primordial awareness.